Hey everyone, thanks for joining us. Today's conversation is going to be on the mind, the brain, consciousness, memory, free will, all that sort of activity that takes place between our ears that we've struggled as a species to understand over the course of millennia. And I'm so pleased to have one of the world's experts on these topics joining us for this conversation. That's Paul Bloom, who is a professor of psychology at the University of Toronto and professor emeritus at Yale. He is well known for his research on the nature of morality, empathy, pleasure, and the development of the human mind. And he's joining us now from Toronto. Welcome, Paul.
It's great to talk to you, Brian.
Great to talk to you, too. And the funny thing is, whereas just before this conversation, we were noting that we haven't really interacted in a very, very long time, it feels to me like I see you every semester, and the reason for that is I teach a course at Columbia called Origins and Meaning, and I use some clips from the World Science Festival of a program that you were in, and so I hear from you almost every semester, in that context. So it's very nice to see you.
A younger version than me, thicker hair.
Actually, no, you
more
actually
vibrant.
You look exactly the same. So
unchanged.
absolutely.
You too, man.
Well, thank you. By lies we flattered be, I guess is what Shakespeare said. But in my case, I'm telling you the truth. So I thought we'd jump in with the most difficult question, sort of jump into the deep end, if you will, which is, of course, David Chalmers, 30 plus years ago, coined this phrase called the hard problem of consciousness, where he basically said, the functioning of the brain, that it can do various things, keep our heart beating, keep our lungs breathing and so forth. Those are difficult problems, but we can kind of see a way that will figure out the underlying mechanism. But when we think about the fact that we have these inner worlds that exist inside of our minds that somehow are generated by mindless, thoughtless particles, how can that come about? And so where do you think we stand on this hard problem of consciousness?
I think we don't know the answer. I think we don't know the answer, and it's not merely a problem where I feel in 6 months, in a year, we'll kind of figure it out. Not only don't we know the answer, we're not even sure what an answer will look like. We're not sure what it would be like to have solved the mystery of consciousness. I'm a psychologist. I'm very interested in what we know, and I think my field has made some great discoveries, but I also think we should be humble. And I don't think consciousness is in the end going to be a sort of spiritual, ghostly thing that goes beyond the realm of science. I don't think it's an illusion, like some people will say. I think it's a very real phenomena, and the most real phenomena we could imagine, the idea that we feel pain and pleasure, we experience, the world, we're awake. But it's just really, really hard. And it's something we're struggling to explain. And it really matters. It matters because, for instance, without a theory of consciousness, it's hard to determine for sure what sort of creatures are conscious and what sort of creatures aren't conscious. I often wonder, I don't think ChatGPT is conscious yet, but would a more sophisticated version, maybe with a robot body that walks around, would that be conscious? How could we know? And so it really matters to get clear on this, and we're really far from answering it.
And it's really tough, as you say, to know, because look, I am assuming that you are conscious, and you're making the same assumption about me, but it's something that we just base on external appearances. I can't get inside your head, and you can't get inside of mine. Right.
It's weird, isn't it? Like it's consciousness. One of the sort of fascinating things about consciousness is that I can't show you my consciousness. I can't know for sure that you're conscious. You can't know for sure I am. But at the same time, it's the most certain thing in the world. I mean, the philosopher René Descartes pointed out, I could doubt all sorts of things. I could doubt that there's a person in front of me. I could say, maybe this is all a dream. But I can't doubt that my knee hurts. I can't doubt that there's something it feels like to be in the world. It's the most immediate, certain thing, but also the most mysterious.
Yeah, totally. And so I agree with you that in the end of the day, I do not think that the answer is going to be some kind of mystical, spiritual thing that goes beyond the physical. But what makes you as a psychologist so confident in that statement?
Maybe I'm too confident. I mean, most psychologists are what we call materialists. We think that everything we do, our decisions, our experiences, are the product of our physical brains. It could turn out that this ends up being mistaken. One reason I'm so confident is that all of the evidence so far has turned that way. So we have some idea where memories reside in the brain. We have some idea where specific emotions are activated in the brain. We could watch the brain respond to things in real time. We could put you in a scanner and ask you to sort of have a sexual fantasy or think about music or try to navigate the way around New York City. And we could look at your brain activation and say, he's doing this, he's doing that, he's doing that. Some people say we're not far from getting to a point where we put you in a scanner while you're dreaming, and we say, he's dreaming about this. We could see this in real time. Now, this doesn't prove materialism. It's possible that the brain is active, but some other immaterial realm is active as well. But I think simplicity, parsimony, suggests that the brain does it. And another consideration is, hundreds of years ago, you might have been skeptical that a physical thing could be intelligent, that it could do interesting, solve mathematical problems, mull over possibilities, understand language. But now we know physical machines can do this because we have computers. And so the idea of a physical machine, a material body that can think without a spirit, is we know that that's possible, and it's very likely we are such things. Now, the question of a consciousness muddies it, because we don't know if other material things are capable of consciousness besides humans and other animals. And there's a bit of a mystery. But like I said, my faith is we've done so well with this assumption that our psychologies could be explained through reference only to the material world. I don't see any reason to expect this to sort of fail on us sometime in the future.
So if you had asked me, and people have, even though I'm not a psychologist, the very same question that I just asked you, my answer would not differ that much from the one that you gave. So we're really on the same page. But there are people who come back at me, and presumably back at you, with the statement of, that's just hubris. Because everything that you're talking about with, intelligent machines doing calculations, playing chess, bidding us a go, that's all just the output of a certain kind of processing. But what makes you think that the inner world that seemingly for human beings accompanies that, why would that also abide by the same kind of physicalism? So do you get that? And at some point, do you throw your hands up and say, yeah, I got to give it to you, we don't know for sure, or do you go further?
No, I will give it to them that we don't know for sure. I will say about what you just said, to modern sensibilities, your response makes perfect sense. And what's the big deal? A physical machine can play a game of chess, can add up numbers. It used to be that philosopher would insist these cognitive capacities of reasoning and understanding and memory, no physical thing could do this. You need an immaterial soul. There was a bit of hubris there too. That turned out to be wrong. I guess what I would say is, to give these critics, their due, they might be right, but I don't see any way of going forward other than proceeding as if our scientific assumptions of the material world, assumptions about cause and effect, of things being amenable to experimental study, that these things are right. We'll continue this way, we might reach a hard stop at some point, or we might come across evidence for miracles or out-of-body experiences or life after death that shake everything up. And I think we should be receptive to that. But I think going as we've gone, hoping that what's succeeded in so many other domains would go on to succeed for subjective experience. I think that's the best way to go, and be properly sort of humble that we might end up failing.
Right. Now there are people like David Chalmers, and probably others too, I don't know the field that well, who, when trying to make progress on this question and sort of running into the kind of brick wall of, you've got these particles, these ingredients. I mean, as a physicist, I always go right down to the particles, but people can go to whatever level of structure you want, that the ingredients don't seem to have conscious awareness. So when you put them together, like, how do you get conscious awareness? Well, it's a puzzle, so maybe we're wrong, and the ingredients do have some kind of proto-conscious awareness, and only when you have enough of them together in the right configuration do you get sort of macroscopic consciousness as we humans experience. Does that hold any interest for you?
I don't know. I mean, this connects to your day job, where I've spoken to people, physicists, who say, "Well, don't you understand? Atoms are conscious. Elementary particles are conscious. They have a little consciousness, and when they add up and turn out in brains, they get into a big consciousness." And to me, this is madness. To me, that consciousness, whatever it is, and maybe whether it requires physical brains, whether it could be made out of metal, requires some degree of structure and complexity. And what you just said, in some way, here's where the analogy with intelligence is a good one. So you said, how can unconscious things, when combined in the right way, give rise to consciousness? It's a very good question. But here's another question. How can unintelligent things, when wired up the right way, give rise to intelligence? Well, we know it can. And the theory of computation, the theory of computational neuroscience, exactly explains how it can. Anybody who constructs a computer that could play chess or can nowadays, beat me in an argument, nobody denies that the way that computer was constructed is by taking little chunks of metal and slamming them together in the right way, and boom, from the structure of it comes intelligence. So my hunch is that the same story will be true of consciousness, and that the sort of panpsychism view that everything in the world is conscious, I don't know, it sounds a little bit bananas to me. I don't want to be critical of people, but it sounds a little bit bananas to me.
But but of course, like we both agreed that you would ascribe consciousness to other species, dogs, yes, cats, and so on. Is it therefore a continuum that stops at some point, maybe with living systems? There's no place beyond that where the notion of consciousness is applicable? Yeah,
I think humans are plainly conscious. At least one of them is, and cups aren't. Not the slightest tinge of consciousness. No, and it matters, because if I break a cup, if it's your cup, I'm sorry, but I'm not sorry for breaking the cup for the cup itself. No one was harmed in breaking the cup. And then you deal with all of the myriad creatures in the world, including human babies, and fetuses, embryos, and I think that there's some consciousness there too. Experiences of pain, reactions to things. And it does seem to be a continuum where I would think that a dog doesn't have the full consciousness of an adult human and has more consciousness than a cockroach. And then there's a point where it just runs out. And where the point is, I don't have the foggiest idea. We just use sort of common sense and intuition. I don't think an amoeba is conscious. But if one of the reasons why we so desperately need a theory of consciousness is to answer these questions. How conscious is a pig or a cow? And how conscious is a fetus or embryo? Because these questions have moral weight as well. Like, if we come 10 years from now where we have AI servants, if they have the consciousness of a toaster, that is no consciousness at all, you do whatever you want with them. You could use a toaster however you want. But if they have some sort of consciousness, even a different sort than ours, then they're slaves. Then we shouldn't order them about. We have to respect them. We can't turn them off at will. So the questions of consciousness, they seem like this sort of airy, philosophical, freshman dorm sort of questions, but they really matter.
Yeah. And so I've little doubt that we will have those AI systems in the not too distant future. How will you handle that? Will you just assume that they aren't conscious?
I think intellectually, my bet is that they aren't. They lack the sort of complexity of consciousness. They're, glorified autocomplete, stochastic parrots, all these epithets we use to describe how stupid they are. But when they become more and more human-like, and when we give them bodies, and when they're at some point, if this would ever happen, they're indistinguishable from people, such that, you're talking to me, but surprise, at the end of the interview it's revealed that I'm a robot. I think it's going to be irresistible to see them as conscious beings. We are evolved by natural selection to see agency and thought and desires and pain in other creatures like us. And as soon as the AIs resemble us, and right now they resemble us in a way that they could talk to us, they sound like us, but once they resemble us physically, I think it's going to be irresistible not to see them as conscious. And whether or not that's right or wrong is a really hard question. But to answer your question, yeah, once we have robot AIs, I think I'll see them as people. And then there's going to be a shift. You could imagine, you get fanciful, 30 years from now, there could be this huge social schism between people saying, free the AIs, they're like slaves, and other people say, oh my God, they're just machines. And one problem is, I don't know how we decide who's right in this sort of argument.
Right. So, but this points to this issue of substrate dependence, I guess is what people often describe it. You know, do you need a gloppy, gray, crenellated structure called the brain of whatever variety it might be, human or otherwise, in order to support consciousness? Or if you have the right connections and the right information processing, does it not matter? So where do you come down on that?
I come down to that I don't know, that I tend to be a gloppy brain guy. I think that some sort of physical structure is necessary. I find it unbelievable, this is not an argument, this is an expression of intuition, that there's anything you do to my MacBook Pro that would make it conscious, that would make breaking it an act of murder. And by the way, this question doesn't just pertain to AIs. A lot of people talk about the idea of taking all of your neurological structure, uploading it into a computer, that it captures all the information that's you. And then what they'll tell you is, and that's you. Congratulations, you're immortal. Your conscious experience lives on in a computer. And I think, is that really true? Or is it just, what if instead of a computer I just put in a big book? Would the book be you? It seems incredible. And
when you say put it in a book, you mean put the information in a static book.
Exactly.
Right.
So is it that because it's static, it doesn't get to be you? The problem of thinking about consciousness and getting involved in these debates is, no matter what option you choose, it leads you to ridiculous conclusions. I find the idea that a MacBook Pro can be conscious to be a ridiculous conclusion. But I also find the idea that only a creature with this kind of brain could be conscious. And so no such thing as an intelligent Martian, no such thing as a conscious robot, also to be ridiculous. So we started a discussion on psychology, and you immediately focused it on the part we know the very least about.
Yeah. So I'm about to move.
I thank you. Big thanks.
Well, I'm about to move on from there, but I just want to ask one other question along these lines, because we were talking about the continuum of consciousness. Yeah. So do you put humans at the far end of that, or not?
Oh, yeah, I do. I do, based on I think that the level and depth and scope of human experience far extends beyond any other creature. I mean, you know, like, look who's talking. It could just be an expression of bias, but we have all of these cultural scaffolding and language and everything. My conscience is not limited to my everyday experience. I could read Anna Karenina or watch The Sopranos and cry. You know, I can imagine all sorts of things. People have depths of experience that are extraordinary. I think within humans, there's also a range of sort of the extent of conscious experience. Some people can feel more than others. I'm a developmental psychologist, and you know, I think the consciousness of you and me is much more than when we were 5 years old, and certainly more than we were babies. Whether or not that's there to stay brings us back to AI. I don't think it's difficult to imagine an AI that's smarter than us in any way you measure it. I'm not sure, we're not there now, but in principle, I don't see why we can't get there. Can we get to an AI whose consciousness is so powerful and vast and rich, it makes ours look like, well, I don't know, what we are to a cockroach? I don't know.
Yeah, and that's of course what some people find terrifying, that
Yes.
we might just be irrelevant to a world in which this kind of intelligence, conscious or not, exists. So that's a topic for another conversation, the frightening aspect of that. But so you mentioned, you know, babies and the consciousness that they have and how it develops ultimately to the consciousness of an adult. What about knowledge, though? So your work has established, I gather, that the blank slate notion that this is an empty vessel waiting to be filled by experience is really not an accurate depiction of what the human brain, or perhaps the brain of any species, is really about.
Yeah, I don't want to pretend there's a consensus here. So I have a certain view which comes under the sort of a label of strong nativist, where I think babies have an extraordinary amount of understanding of the world, that we've evolved through natural selection to have an understanding of the physical world, the social world, even morality, that there's this innate built-in core. Some people say that this is too strong, that the knowledge of a baby is weaker. But what I think nobody denies by now is that the blank slate notion is mistaken. Nobody thinks that, as Skinner did, that there's no difference between a human brain and a rat brain and a pigeon brain. Nobody believes, as Skinner did and as the sort of empiricists through history believe, that everything we know is a product of experience. There's enough experimental demonstrations by people like my advisor, Susan Carey, who's now at Harvard, or Liz Spelke, her colleague, that these extraordinary demonstrations that young babies understand how objects behave, how they move across space and time. They have some rudimentary understanding of people.
And how do they get that? How do they get that insight from a baby?
Oh, so cool. Babies can't do much. You can't ask them. They can't follow instructions, but they can do certain things. They could generate brainwaves, and some studies have done sort of little baby fMRI or baby brain scans to see what's happening. But most of the work has come from looking time experiments, and so certain things about babies. Babies often tend to look longer when they're surprised at something. So here's a simple experiment. You can't ask a baby, do you expect unsupported objects to fall down? You can't. But you can do an experiment where you take a ball and you release it and it falls down. Or you take a ball and you release it, and because there's a hidden wire, it stays there. You do this with a baby of a certain age, the baby will look longer.
And do you think that's coming from the experience of that baby having seen things fall? Or is there some built-in module or something which is like the gravity module, and if something disobeys it?
So for gravity, I think there's a lot of debate about that. For other things, I think there's a very strong evidence for a built-in module. And the sort of thing I'm thinking of would be the understanding that objects persist when they're out of sight. So, you take an object, you put it behind a screen, the screen drops, babies expect the object to be there. If it's gone, they're surprised. And one reason why I think that stuff shows up is part of our sort of built-in equipment is that it shows up very early, and it shows up in other species as well. So for instance, there's some experiments done with newborn baby chicks, just brand new newborn, finding that they have expectations about objects and how they behave. And that can't be explained through experience. And in some way, it shouldn't surprise us. Animals have all these physical adaptations for dealing with the world. Is it so surprising we come in with sort of expectations about cognitive, intelligent expectations about how things should work and how people should act? It seems to make sense to me.
So you think that there's structure in the brain of either the chicks or humans that encodes in its operating system certain qualities of the external world, and these are passed down through the generations so that they're all going to be surprised if an object is released and it doesn't fall, for example?
Yeah, I think that the story of a lot of these capacities comes from natural selection, which is that members of our species and other species who came in with a built-in expectation of how the world works are quicker to acquire information about the world and end up being better at the game of survival and reproduction than those who don't. It may not just be features of the world in the sense of sort of what one would perceive. It may be other things as well. So we're very social animals, and some of the sociality may be built into us. And you may not say that's not in the world itself, it's in the sort of world we create. So I've been involved in research that was led by Kylie Hamlin, who's now a professor at University of British Columbia, where we did a series of studies where we show babies these one-act plays. And in one of them, a character's trying to get up the hill. One character comes in gently, helps it up, and another character bangs it down. And then we put in front of the baby the good guy and the bad guy, the one who helped and the one who hindered it. And as young as we could test them, and this is with reaching, not looking, they prefer the good guy over the bad guy. And in other studies, they sort of prefer in all sorts of ways those who are kind versus those who are unkind. My colleague.
Are you telling me that from a get-go we're kind of a good species?
Well, from the get-go, we are a species that has a moral nature. I think that there's a lot of evidence for goodness in it, that some of our adaptations, we have adaptations for compassion, for kindness. These show up spontaneously in development. They show up in a lab, but they show up in the real world. There's already studies showing that toddlers will help others unprompted, that they'll burst into tears at the sadness of others. And of course, in every society we grow to have a moral system, a moral code, which differs from society to society, but also has certain commonalities. Are we a good species? I mean, side by side with our goodness comes all sorts of other motivations, particularly self-interest. There's always studies showing that say toddlers know that the proper way to divide two candies is one for you and one for me. And they prefer if someone else divides them, one for you, one for me, that's a good thing. But you put the candies in front of the kid will snarf them both down. And in a million ways, you and I do the same.
Right.
So, for instance, there's studies with children as well as for adults saying that we recognize unfairness, even if the unfairness benefits us. But we complain about unfairness that hurts us the most. When unfairness benefits us, we're often silent.
And so, from a standpoint of evolution by natural selection, the naive way of thinking about it would be, we're gonna have built-in desires to do those things that are gonna benefit us the most, give us a leg up in this battle for survival. So when we do things that are, altruistic or compassionate, in the end, would one view that as self-serving because it puts us into a group that allows us to survive better than we would if we were off by ourselves in the wilderness, so it's ultimately for our greater good?
It's a good question, and I think to get a grip on it, you got to make a distinction between what psychologists call ultimate explanations, like why is something there, versus proximate explanations, which is in the here and now, why do we do it? And here's an example of altruism. People tend to love their children. People tend to love their babies. They take care of their babies. They don't eat their babies. They feed their babies and so on. And so you may say, well, why do they do it? And then somebody could say, well, it's selfish. Animals that help their babies, plainly, are more likely to reproduce than animals that eat their babies. So eating your baby is a dead end, helping your baby is a plus. Natural selection says, help your baby, take care of your baby. I think that's true. I think that's why we take care of our babies. But from a psychological standpoint, it's not selfish at all. What natural selection has given us as a way to achieve this goal is it's made us love our babies. And the love is no less real by the fact that it's the product of natural selection, any more than it's no less real by the fact it's a product of our physical brains. And I think this is true for morality in general. So an evolutionary biologist could give, I think, a good story for why we're predisposed to be grateful when somebody is kind to us, why we are resentful and angry when somebody cheats us, why we help our friends and help our family, maybe more so than we help strangers, and give these evolutionary explanations. But none of this precludes the fact that when we actually do it in the real world, we're not thinking about reproduction or our genes or whatever. We really love our kids. We love our friends. We really feel gratitude. We really feel anger, righteous anger, when we see unfairness and cruelty. And so I think a sort of natural selection explanation for how these capacities emerge could exist side by side with the sort of common sense theory that nobody loves their kids because they feel this is a great way to get their genes spread through the environment. We love them because they're our kids.
Right. And so as we look across the world's cultures, I presume there have been studies of babies and other phenomenon that we've brushed up against here. Are there significant differences that one can see at the level of a baby in different cultures, or that's pretty universal?
When you test the youngest of babies, you tend to find that babies all over the world behave the same way. But later on, humans start to diverge. Cultures have very different practices in how they treat babies. Some cultures, like my culture, puts the baby in a crib, maybe in his own room. Other cultures, the majority of cultures, carry their babies with them. There's these differences, and these differences leave a mark. And one of the big debates in my field is when you start looking at children and then adults, how pervasive are cross-cultural differences? How deep, on the flip side of it is how deep are universals? And psychology has had a series of revolutions recently in how we study things. And one of the revolutions is over exactly what you're talking about, which is the accusation is that we have been studying up to now so-called weird populations, which are Western, educated, industrialized, rich democracies. So, there's all these examples, I'm going to make up the numbers, but an undergraduate, a psychological study is more likely, it's like 1,000 times more likely to test an undergraduate in an American university than a resident of Africa. We study the people around us.
Right.
And psychology is working very hard to wean itself away from that habit and study people from all around the world. That places where kids don't go through formal education, where they're not democracies, that they're not industrialized. And you do find all sorts of differences. My feeling is, and this is again my own bias, that when you look closely, you find many more similarities. So moralities differ from society to society in obvious ways. In some societies, it is immoral to forbid women to work because they're women. In other societies, the idea of women working is grotesque. Is a horrible thing. You get these plain differences. But I think in every society, we feel grateful to those who help us. We feel guilty if somebody helps and we can't reciprocate. We feel angry when we're screwed. We love our children. We seek vengeance against those who harm us and those who love. A long list of moral universals that are pre-wired.
Yeah. And so along the lines of the innate qualities, if I can just go back to physics for a moment, just because it has a particular interest for me and the rest of our core audience here, would you say that we have innate knowledge of certain qualities of the physical world, or a kind of a primed predilection for quickly understanding and absorbing qualities of the external world?
It's a good question, because people have struggled to sort of articulate what the difference is. So if is there a big difference between a baby who's predisposed to think of the world as containing material objects that influence each other by contact, versus this knowledge is sort of triggered by the experience of seeing things, but babies are biased to treat these interactions one way or another? And it gets technical. It really gets in the weeds. I think I'm willing to sort of buy onto a sort of hardcore view that would make Plato happy, which is that the idea is that babies are in some sense little physicists. They're not in a sense of that you are, but in a sense of they really have beliefs and a knowledge of how the physical world works. One that is obviously limited, and for all of these, it's actually fascinating to see what babies know and what they don't know. So for the physical world, for instance, they seem to understand a lot about physical objects. They're very confused about substances. Substances, like, there's head scratchers for babies, and they get confused very easy about substances.
What do you mean by substances here?
Like water and sand. And they get confused. But for number, for instance, babies are great for 1, 2, and 3. They know 1 + 1 = 2. They know 3 - 2 = 1 and everything. But they get really confused by 0. And they get really confused by the higher numbers.
But that's interesting, because 0 was introduced much later on, right? In
some way, if you want to know what requires learning, the history of science is actually a good clue. So negative numbers were just a huge accomplishment very late. And similarly, for a child, negative numbers are really tough and come in very late. What comes in early are the natural numbers, like 1, 2, and 3. And no surprise, that comes in early in human history as well.
Right, right. And so this gives rise to either innate knowledge or intuitive knowledge. I've heard the phrase intuitive physics that sometimes psychologists use. So, but generally speaking, how good is our intuitive grasp of the world? I mean, I gather, and do correct me if I'm wrong, I would think of intuition as a shortcut, so that when we encounter problems in the world, we can navigate them more quickly than we would if we actually sat down and deliberated, you know, and everything that coming at us, we would never do anything if it required that kind of processing. So in that sense, intuition is really valuable, but I presume it can also be grossly misleading as well.
Absolutely. So how good are we? We're very good if you we're very good for the tests we've evolved to pass. You know, dealing in a world with middle-sized objects and animals of a certain size and people that work in a certain way. But of course, all of these intuitions fall apart. For instance, in the physical world, when we're dealing with the very big and the very small.
Right.
And physics, the history of physics has been, you know, telling us, yeah, okay, your common sense is fine for, you know, not running into a tree. It is very poor when trying to understand the movement of heavenly bodies and how and the structure of an atomic structure and so on. And so in some ways science builds on this intuitive system, but also, you know, supersedes it. That often also says, you know, common sense is just wrong. And this is true in every domain. It is true in the physical domain, it's true in the mathematical domain. You know, apparently, you know, the number of natural numbers is the same as the number of even numbers, because that's how infinity works. Who knew? Right. This doesn't sit well with us.
Right, right. No, it's totally counterintuitive, some of these qualities. You know, oftentimes when I lecture at a general level, or even when I teach my technical classes, I emphasize to the students that point that you're making, that your intuition emerged so you could navigate the everyday world of common experience. Why would you think that if you go beyond that to the very small atoms or the very big or the very fast, going near the speed of light, why should your intuition be any good?
That's right. If we regularly traveled near the speed of light, our intuitions would have been different. But no, this is not a normal state of affairs. I gotta since you beat me down with consciousness at the beginning, I gotta tell you about the great success story in my field, I think, and this is the work of Danny Kahneman and Amos Tversky. Kahneman passed away at the age of 90 a while ago. He's one of our few Nobel Prize winners, and the work he's most famous for is what we're talking about, is this time not understanding the physical world, but understanding of probability, understanding of efficacy for reason. And it's a similar story where he and his collaborator Amos Tversky really convincingly demonstrated that we have these rough and ready heuristics that really help us make it through the world. So one such heuristic is, if something is really salient and you hear about it a lot, assume it's frequent. Then for 99% of the history of our species, that was a great heuristic. But in a world of news media, it fails us. So people radically overestimate the likelihood of plane crashes and being attacked by a shark, because when these happen, it's all over the place, and it's on a front page. When somebody dies of a stroke or in a cross-country car ride, nobody puts it on the front page of the New York Times, so people think it's much less frequent than it is. So again, you have the same sort of story that we're talking about, where natural selection wires us up to do extremely well for the sort of exam that we're training for. But then you take it to the real world, particularly the modern world, and it often falters.
But is that the key there? Is it the fact that these brain qualities, these intuitions, were shaped by evolution, by natural selection on the African savanna, 50,000 generations ago or whatever it is, and then you come to the modern world and we haven't changed all that much, but now when a plane crashes, it's on television and it's on news, and that wasn't the way it was back then, presumably. You didn't get information of everything from around the world, and so whatever it is, the module was shaped in a different world, and yet we're still using it.
I think there's a million examples just like that. And it's not just our understanding, it's our feelings. So in the world in which we evolved in, for almost all of it, if you disrespect me, I gotta respond. I gotta come back at you, because if you disrespect me, everybody sees you disrespect me. My status could drop. If you find you could get the better of me today, you'll get the better of me tomorrow. I have to address it, so I get angry. I try to retaliate. But if I'm driving on I-95 and some jackass cuts me off, none of that applies. We're strangers. I'm never going to see him again. There's no logic to it. But my Stone Age mind says, uh-oh, threat to my status, disrespect, anger. And before I know it, I'm kind of chasing him down and honking my horn.
And so with that knowledge, just as an individual, does that help you not put your foot on the gas on I-95? I mean,
it's a deep question, because sometimes knowing that that something is the product of evolution, but doesn't apply here, does help us override it. Sometimes we can, for instance, think mathematically about problems and put into a statistics program rather than trust our gut. Sometimes we could have the self-control to say this is unreasonable, but it's hard. I mean, visual illusions don't go away even once you know what causes them. And somebody cuts me off, I might still get angry. It's hard to shut these things down. I mean, some people argue that certain great traditions in the world are in some sense at war with natural selection. So Robert Wright talks about Buddhism and says that, it is so fundamental to us to have these deep desires and attachments. And the techniques of Buddhist meditation, sort of, mindfulness and detachment, are attempts to sort of, fiddle with the system, unplug certain things and jury rig it so that in some way fighting against these evolutionary mandates. From the standpoint of morality, we have evolved to love those in our tribe so much more than strangers. But moral philosophers like Peter Singer would say, yeah, but think about it. It's not, if you think about it and apply your logic and rationality to it, you shouldn't be doing this. Now, none of this is going to make me love a stranger like I love my sons. But it could make me reflect upon it and think, yeah, but I got to understand that from the standpoint of an objective standpoint, the life of somebody living in sub-Saharan Africa is just as valuable as the life of my beloved son. So I think, long-winded answer, but I think through rationality and reason, sometimes we can override these evolutionary biases.
But not easy.
Not easy.
Yeah.
Not easy. Most people don't do it, and most people don't do it all the time. I bet a lot of times when you're crossing the street, you don't think like a physicist. And you just use this innate module and everything. You'd probably be dead by now if you sort of started to mull over the exact trajectories of things.
Yeah, I often joke to my students that those of our forebears, say on the African savannah, in the early days, who stopped to think about black holes and electrons and quantum physics, they're the ones that got eaten, and that's why we don't have those qualities of the world in our intuition, because they were not just not selected for, but they were anti-selected for. If you thinking about the wrong thing, you don't see that lion that's about to eat you. That is for sure.
Natural selection has no patience for Hamlet.
Yeah, exactly.
And the great philosopher Jerry Fodor talked about modules, and he said modules are evolved, built in, but also they're often fast and automatic. And he quotes the poet Ogden Nash, who wrote, "When approached by a panther, don't answer." Move fast.
Yeah, that's good. That is good. And so we have a sense, I guess, of why certain things are in our intuition, and why, for instance, we may have wrong intuitions. What about wrong memories? I know this has been an area of research as well. Our memories are like everything, right? For us as an individual, it's how we define ourselves, it's how we evaluate ourselves. It's all based on this past set of experiences. How reliable is our memory of those experiences?
So occasionally in person and online, people pick fights with me because I wrote a book all about psychology, and I'm kind of a booster of the field. And they say, you guys haven't discovered anything. You guys haven't discovered anything that's surprising or interesting. And I have certain examples to prove it wrong. One of them is babies, which I think people are often surprised at how much babies know. But another is memory. There's a very common sense conception of memory, which a lot of people have, which is like, it's like a video recorder. It's like you constantly have your iPhone out, you're recording everything. Everything gets in there. And sometimes you can't remember it, you can't find it, but in those cases we'd use a hypnotist, or you could really try and it'll come back. And one of the findings of psychology is that's tremendously wrong. It is, and that memory is limited, it is flawed, and it is to a tremendous extent reconstructive. And what I mean by that is the memories you have from an experience will be shaped by your goals, by your expectations, by the question that they're asked. Classic experiment was you show people a video of a school bus and there's an accident, and you say to half of them, I have some questions for you. And one question is, did you see when a school bus, hit the wall? The other group gets something like, did you see when a school bus smashed into the wall? Then an hour later you ask, how fast was the school bus going, do you think? And people who were asked about the smash said it's going faster, because that sort of said, oh, it smashed, it must have been going fast. And in everyday life, I often have people who tell me, oh, let me tell you, this happened to me 2 years ago. And it's word for word detail and everything. And I immediately, it's totally wrong. It may have never even happened. I was once at a party, and I told it what I thought was a very funny story about what something that happened to me. And and on the way back, my wife, very gently, she didn't tell me at the time, said, it didn't happen to you, it happened to me. I said, you sure? But she told me the story. It's a good story. Put in my little part of my brain called good stories. Put myself in there, and that stuff is so common.
Wow. And so the school bus is an interesting example. Are there other psychological studies that have really demonstrated the fallibility of?
Yeah, there's some lovely work done by Elizabeth Loftus, who's kind of the champion of this sort of stuff, where she successfully implanted false memories into people. And it doesn't always work with people. Some people are very robust against it, but some people are suckers. You could implant a false memory very easy. But she basically asked these people questions about different life experiences, some which they really had. She had questioned them before and questioned their parents, and some which never happened. So, a story of when you were a kid, you went to a wedding, and you knocked over the wedding cake, and it was a big to-do, and you burst into tears and everything. And she just asked people questions about this over the course of time. Then later on, they remember it, and they remember it crystal clear. And there are so many real-world cases, and this is sort of the practical application of psychology, where, the cops believe you did it. They're not messing around. They believe you did it, and you're sort of reluctant, but you get interrogated for many, many hours, and they have the evidence, and they badger you, and they push you, and they say, we know you did it. And some people confess. Now, the less interesting case are when they confess because they're terrified or they're pressured or threatened. But in a not small set of cases, people confess because they believe they did it. The questioning has instilled in them this memory where they did, and they believe they did it. And later on, like some video evidence comes out, I'm 100% sure they didn't do it.
Wow.
There are cases of people who have written books or are told these written detailed articles about traumatic events that happened to them in a war, for instance, 10 years ago, 20 years ago.
Well, like Hillary.
And then people look at you.
Hillary
right?
had.
So there was a case where Hillary Clinton describes, I forget where it was, but she came out of a helicopter at some place, and there was heavy firing at her, and they had to duck for cover. And then video comes out, and there it is, a nice sunny day, and none of this is happening. And people at the time, I remember Christopher Hitchens said, what a liar, what a psychopathic liar she is to lie about these things. And my thought is, that's how memory works, man. We reconstruct all the time. And what the thing about it is, it's not merely that these memories are false, but unfortunately, the falsity, the fuzziness of it, doesn't lead us to doubt them. We are totally sure this thing happened to us. And And this has real world consequences. It has legal consequences. It has consequences for eyewitness testimony. It has consequences for therapy, where there were a lot of cases where people were enthusiastic therapists who are eager to sort of figure out what hidden trauma a person has had, end up instilling a memory into them, sometimes through hypnosis, sometimes through other means. They don't intend to do this, but this stuff could be terribly harmful. People have left therapy believing that they've been victims of terrible crimes, and it proves to be entirely not true. But that's how memory works.
And so you mentioned though that there are differences. Some people are more robust against implanted memories. I presume some are better at actually remembering what did happen. And yet, in the legal system, as far as I know, there's no vetting of witnesses, right? So would you suggest that there needs to be some kind of preliminary assessment of how good a potential witness is at recalling things from the past before they're on the stand and making statements that can affect someone else's life?
I don't think we have good tests for that, but what we do have, and what's been sort of transforming the legal system so much that we don't even remember a time before that, is much more robust tests of memory. So, back in the day, if somebody, stole my wallet, I don't know, maybe they dragged the suspect in front of me and they say, is this the guy? This is a terrible way to do things. Because I'm yes, it is, with total confidence. Now, we have lineups. And a lineup is, as a scientist, a lineup's a great method, because a lineup is a test against randomness. If I really don't remember, I should be random if you chose people who look kind of alike. I think eyewitness testimony is still a problem in the legal context, because when somebody goes on a stand and says, this happened to me, with total confidence, it's very hard not to believe them. They believe it, they're not lying, they're totally confident, and only a psychologist would worry, well, if it was 6 months ago, if it was, I can't, these things, you cannot really trust memories.
And so do you have a sense from psychological studies, real data, I know this is an ill-formed question, but maybe take it wherever you can, like what % of firsthand experience that people on a witness stand or just me talking to you, is there a sense of 5% of it is, or is it like 75% of it is really kind of fabricated or constructed? It's made up.
Yeah. One way to answer that is 100%, where if I asked you something that happened to you yesterday and got a description of it, your best memory of it, you're going to be wrong in some ways. But that's not what you're asking. You're asking kind of how wrong. And I don't know. I mean, in some way, this is not an extremely bizarrely skeptical thing. On the way here for lunch, I stopped and I had a bagel at a place down Spadina on the way here. And honestly, if you said, I don't believe you, memory's infallible, it was 3 hours ago. I had a bagel. I swear to God, I have a receipt. So I'm not saying I'm not saying it's all.
What was on the bagel?
It was smoked salmon.
Oh, good.
Or was it roast beef? I don't know. Sesame, or whole wheat. On the other hand, if you said, I don't know, you asked me something for 5 years ago. In your honeymoon, what did you do the first? What restaurant you go to? Then I'd say extremely unreliable. And then you might imagine, by the way, that for highly salient events like 9/11, where were you at 9/11? We would ask each other. Memories would be more accurate because they're salient. But here's a problem. You no longer remember where you were when the towers were attacked. But you do remember the many stories, times you were asked and many times you said. And your conversations about it have been distorted. Your memories has been distorted by your talking about it.
Right.
And
now
so
that one's
for
an
very salient events.
But that's an interesting one, because for me, I was on an airplane, during 9/11, sitting on the runway, and I could see the towers from Kennedy bursting into flames.
Yeah.
I think that's really what happened.
Yeah.
But I slightly have wondered over the years, have I exaggerated it?
It's quite a memory, isn't it? It's quite a cinematic memory.
Yeah, because
I don't have any reason to tell you, but that's That's a really good story.
Because the towers are far away. Even when you're sitting at Kennedy on the runway, there aren't buildings in the way because they're so tall, the towers were. But then I say to myself, in my mind, it's like the towering inferno, like close-up. And I said, that can't be true.
Yeah.
I was miles away. And yet, it feels so real. And so it's sort of true. It's just been augmented. You know, Sensorround or something has been added to it.
That's right. That's right. Maybe, so I assume you probably were on a plane.
Yeah, that I'm sure about.
But details were put in. Maybe a conversation where you had the person next to you was put in. Maybe of all the stories you heard about some other people, maybe some of them were on a plane, and you took that and put that into your story. And that's how memory works. And it's a sense of human fallibility. I know some people think that there's sort of an adaptive cleverness to this fuzziness of memory. I don't know. It might just be that brains are made of meat and they're physical things and they decay, and we remember things not for their own sake. In a modern world, we remember things because it's important to recount our histories. But in the system we evolved, memories are just relevant only to the extent that they dictate future action. So the details almost never matter, at all. But it's the fallibility is not the problem. It's our confidence in them, which is the problem, and leads to all sorts of tragedies.
Wow. Yeah. Sure.
I got to say, like, probably 2 years from now, 10 years from now, I'll be asked about 9/11. I'll say, I was on a plane, man. I saw it from a distance.
There you go. And so, you know, when we recognize that memories are, in some sense, created, do you see a kind of pattern in the way they're created or modified? Like if someone has a very, upbeat personality, do they tend to sort of add things that have that quality, where someone who's a little bit of a downer tends to make things darker and more depressing in retrospect? Is there that kind of a bias that works its way in?
You're in the wrong field. That'd be a great study. I don't know if there's where. I think what you find is memories are shaped by things. We know memories are shaped by things that we all share. So one of these things is expectations. So classic study, you can do this in an intro psych class, where you tell people a story about somebody who goes to a restaurant, and you say, this happened, this happened, this happened, this happened. And then you say later, so tell me everything I told you. And what people, you never put in the story that they paid the bill. Most people say, oh yeah, and you said they paid the bill, because that's a natural thing to put in, so you put it in. It should have been there. Also, though, and this connects more to what you're saying, certain things, memory is often very self-serving. If you have ever had an argument with your partner about something which is a dispute, you will often find your memories, and you're not lying. Your memories really have you as the reasonable, calm person who did the appropriate thing, and your partner is the one who got angry at you for no reason at all. Weirdly enough, your partner may have a flipped memory where you are the villain and your partner is the good person. So memories are often self-serving in that way.
Right. And so when it comes to the age-old debate, if you will, about, we've been talking about the things that are inbuilt in some sense. And of course, there's the influence, which influences our memories from the external environment, the old nature versus nurture, which I guess now we'd call sort of genetics versus environmental influence. Where have we gained insight into that issue? I mean, do we have a sense of the degree to which we are genetically determined versus shaped by experience?
We do. I mean, the question can be asked in two ways. One way is regarding things that are universal. So to what extent, as we all develop our capacity for reason and language, is our growth driven by our genes and by our environment? But I think people are most interested in this question about differences. Some of us are smarter than others. Some of us are more extroverted. You have gifts in physics, which I don't have any. My mathematical and spatial abilities are fairly low. I'm not gifted in that way. I don't like cheese. Most people I know like cheese. I just hate it. And all of these million
all cheeses.
differences. Every cheese.
Even cream cheese.
Hate it.
Really?
Hate it. Mozzarella on pizza is an exception.
Wow.
You have got me there. You talk about it. We go for hours on this one.
Right.
And I'm not lactose intolerant, by the way. But, my wife doesn't like spicy foods. I love them. That sort of thing. A million differences that make life interesting. And we know a few things about this. One thing is we know that the genes play a big effect. That if your parents have a big effect on you, but mostly in the moment of conception. And that if I could get data on your biological mother and your biological father, I could predict a lot about you. I could, some of those obvious things, like how tall you are,
right,
how heavy you'll be. Not 100%. Sometimes short parents have a tall kid, but roughly. But also how well you score on IQ tests, how whether or not you have a prison record, your likelihood of getting divorced. Yeah, there's reasonable predictive power.
You're saying that's one thing. When you say that, are you saying about my biological parents just their genetic makeup, or you need their whole life history?
Even if they had. You could do it through life history, or you could have them, spit into a cup and do a genetic analysis and get some predictive power that way.
Even predictive power on divorce? That is?
Yes.
Really?
So divorce is heritable.
Wow.
Meaning that you could predict to some extent, based on genetic factors only, whether somebody will get divorced. Eric Turkheimer has the sort of 3 laws of behavioral genetics, and the first law is every psychological trait is heritable. Sometimes only to a small amount, but every psychological trait is heritable. And the thing about your biological parents is, even if you had never met them, even if they had, shipped you off to an orphanage the moment you were born. At the same time, though, another finding is almost nothing is entirely genetic. Even things that you might imagine are very genetic, like alcoholism or propensity for schizophrenia, have an enormous environmental predictor. So sometimes you have identical twins, which are fundamentally genetic clones, 99%. And one is gay and one is straight. And one gets schizophrenia and one doesn't. And one's a musical genius and the other one's a musical dope. So, so the genes, even this shows that the genes can't play 100% role. The rest is environment. And then the real surprise.
Paul, can I ask you on that, though?
Go on, yeah.
So is it an unfair and an inaccurate dichotomy to say genes and environment? I'm just, take the example of the musical genius and the musical dope that you just gave. Could it simply be other chemical aspects of the biological system? I mean, genes are not everything, after all. And so is it simply that these two twins encountered music differently or something that makes that big a difference? Or is it just more subtle differentiators in their biological makeup?
Oh, it could definitely be more subtle things. So the contrast that people are interested in tends to be genes versus environment. But you're exactly right. When we think about environment, we think of whether somebody got a good teacher at school, or whether somebody won the lottery, or whether somebody has a domineering parent or a permissive parent. But environment could include the prenatal environment. It could include all sorts of chemical subtleties and so on. The twins might be genetic clones, but one of them might have had a better time in the uterus than the other and got more nutrients or something like that. And that would play a role too. And this is not a sort of abstract philosophical point. A lot of people would argue that say propensity for diseases later in life might have to do with what happens to the mother when she's pregnant. So women who are pregnant during famines, or during war sometimes, will have children who later on are more susceptible to certain diseases, including psychological diseases. So you're exactly right to say this. When we're talking about environment, we mean something very broad. And so the twins, the differences that you have would have to be due to differences in environment, but that could include all sorts of things. So you get genes, you get environment, but one of the surprising facts, there's maybe one of the most controversial findings of behavioral genetics, isn't that genes play a big role, because everybody's learned to live with that so far. It's that there are surprisingly weak effects of parenting. So, very crudely, 50% of, say, your personality is determined by your genes. So then people say, okay, but the other 50% must be whether you had a permissive mother or a domineering father or anything. It turns out the effects of parenting are often weak and non-existent. And one of the sort of surprises is I think it's extremely important how you parent your kids. You have tremendous control over them, over how happy you'll make them, over their quality of life, over your relationship with them. But there's not much evidence that your parenting style would affect whether or not they grow up to be successful or not successful, whether they grow up to be aggressive or passive. Environment matters, but it's other forms of environment that we don't quite understand.
And so if Freud had that data, I no doubt you were thinking of studies that have established the less impact of parenting than certainly I would have intuitively, back to our conversation on intuition, would have thought.
That's right.
If Freud would have had that data, would he have gone in a different direction?
Yes. Freud was in some way an extreme believer in the power of the environment, including a parental environment. So he said that one form of parenting will make kids gay, another form of parenting will turn them into paranoid schizophrenics. He put tremendous weight over the kids, how the kids, the boys' early sexual attraction to his mother gets resolved. He put tremendous emphasis on something you probably have never heard of, called the primal scene. And the primal scene, according to Freud, is when the kid walks into his parents' bedroom while they're making love. And for Freud, this is a big thing. Like, unfortunately, I missed it, but this is a big thing, and it shapes the kids' psychologies and so on. And we could talk about this. I am a fan of Freud. I think Freud gets an unfair bad rap. A lot of my colleagues hate him and think it's just sham and a fraud. I get a hard time because I teach a whole class on Freud, my intro psych class, and people say, why do you waste your time on that man? But in this regard, Freud was, as best we know, 100% wrong. Just about everything Freud said about the effects of parents on their kids has had no evidence at all.
But
like
presumably,
Freud, for instance.
Yeah, go ahead. No, go ahead. Okay.
Sorry, Freud, for instance, put tremendous weight over this style of toilet training for a kid.
Oh, really?
Because that would affect the kids getting out of the anal stage, and then basically bad toilet training leads to an obsessive stinginess, on analogy with keeping your feces inside your body, or an outward personality, And he had these very fanciful theories with no data, and not surprisingly, none of them seem to have turned out.
Right, but your respect presumably just comes from someone who was willing to take on these questions and recognize that there's a lot of complex stuff happening inside of our heads. Is that sort of?
It's two things. First thing, it's hard not to respect the man himself, who was at extraordinary energy and a real brilliance. These astonishing gifts throughout his life. He was nominated for the Nobel Prize, not for medicine, which is where he would want it, but for literature.
Yeah.
Because of the force of his writing, which still, you read Civilization and it's discontent, and it's just a brilliant book. But my real respect for Freud is that Freud gave us this. He was not the first to think of this, but he was the first to take it and run with it. And this is the idea of the dynamic unconscious. And this is the idea where that we might think we know why we do what we do. We might think like, oh, I'm marrying this person because she's so kind to me, she's so beautiful. I hate this guy because, he's a jerk and so on. I decided to become a psychologist because of such and so, such and so. And Freud's insight is, we often don't know why we do these things. We could be totally wrong. And I think this is true. I think so much of modern psychology respects the idea of the unconscious. Even political psychology. So I have a lot of colleagues who are very interested in why some people voted for Trump and other people voted for Harris. And you know what they don't do? They don't say, why'd you vote for Trump? Why'd you vote for Harris? Because they're justifiably skeptical that people actually fully know. Everybody has their own stories, but people are often influenced by forces they're unaware of. And I think that's a real powerful insight about humanity, and it's something we largely owe to Freud.
Yeah. And along those lines, though, I mean, when you try to think about the hidden forces that cause people to think X, believe Y, do Z, right? I mean, one of the questions, of course, that comes up is, why do people believe things that are manifestly false? Right? Why do people believe in conspiracy theories? Now, the only thing that I've ever seen that seemed to make any sense to me, and it's how I think about things, so disabuse me if I'm completely wrong, it's just, if you're part of a group, and you want to maintain your affiliation with that group, and that group has this perspective on the world, that trumps no pun intended, that wins over everything, right? I mean, so of course you're going to believe the going version of reality because you don't want to be excluded from membership in this particular social group.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I think that, we talked about cognitive biases before, like the work of Kahneman and Tversky. And one of the biases we possess that's the strongest is sometimes called the my side bias, which is a bias to interpret the world through the prejudices and interests of your group and yourself. And one way to sort of elaborate on what you said is ask the question, why do we have beliefs at all? And well, one answer we have beliefs is because they help us navigate the sort of physical world. I believe that there's, soda in the fridge, so when I'm thirsty, I'll go to the fridge and get it, and it's all useful and everything. But another reason why we have beliefs is that we're social animals and we want to coordinate with other people. So, take a belief a while ago that Barack Obama was actually born in Kenya and was not an American citizen. It didn't have conspiracy theory, didn't have much evidence for it. But if you were in a community where everybody believed that, it's actually really important for you to believe it too. It's very advantageous. If you didn't believe it, nobody would like you, and you wouldn't do well. And that's the sort of argument. I'm a liberal professor in Canada, so I'm giving you an argument that favors my side. But there's a million cases where liberal people have views. Say, over in COVID, a lot of liberal people had views that were manifestly mistaken and proven to be mistaken later on. But they had these views not because they were true, but because it was part of their political alliance, their political belief system. And who am I to say that they were mistaken? They were factually mistaken, but these beliefs were important for their reputation, for their social status, and so on. And so I tend to be sort of, in some way, a functionalist when it comes to these things, which is show me a conspiracy theory that somebody has. And I think the first question we should ask isn't, oh, how could they be so deranged as to believe that, but is that, what function does this fulfill?
I think that is so important. Yeah. So important because there are so many examples where it feels like the response of the educated has been to say, we just need to get the information out there. We need to get, and my view is, yeah, good, get the information out there, fine. But that is not the cause. It is not as though people are looking at information, they're missing something, and that's why they're holding this belief. They're holding this belief for deeply important but radically different reasons. Yeah,
and again, it's really easy to see this in other people. You say, oh my God, they're so groupie and they're not latched on to the truth. But we can see this within our own tribe as well. Just to take a recent example, I was probably one of the many people who was insisting that Joe Biden, up until that disastrous debate with Trump, was, oh, he's fully on full capacity, he's a brilliant man and everything. Only a rabid conspiracy theorist would say that there's something wrong with him cognitively. Did I say this because all the evidence was on my side? No, I said this because I'm a member of a tribe.
Yeah.
And this is and for the most part, we default to the views of our tribe. And then sometimes they turn out to be disastrously wrong. Now, we should understand this. I think it's a terrible cognitive habit to get into. I think in some sense, it's a sort of cognitive tragedy of the commons. So the tragedy of the commons is the economist's idea that there are situations where it's in everybody's individual interest to do something. But if we all do it, in this case, like having your animals graze on a commons, the commons will become depleted and we all suffer. And this happens, and this is sort of one of the paradoxes of where cooperation and restraint and law have to come in. I think there's a cognitive version of it too, where it's perfectly reasonable for me to adopt the views of my tribe and not the truth. It's perfectly reasonable for you to do that too. But if we all do that, the world becomes manifestly worse.
Yeah.
And I think we should develop institutions and work harder to try to get a situation where somebody's like, yeah, I know everybody says this, but I've looked at the data and it's that. And people don't get pilloried for it.
Yeah. I mean, do you think that's realistic? I mean, because we have to, at some point, have some strategy that is much more effective than two sides becoming ever more polarized.
Yeah, I don't know how realistic this is. This is, people always say this is the worst time in America, this is the worst time in America. But to some extent, this is the worst time in America, at least for things like polarization, where the political parties, particularly as Trump came into power, become tremendously polarized. Republican, Democrat, tremendously polarized. Whether polarization in itself is a terrible thing is sort of a separate question. But from what we're talking about, the polarization leads to each side, not, as the expression goes, not only having its own beliefs and priorities, but their own facts.
Yeah.
And so, there are movements that try to transcend this. I'm a big fan of the sort of rationalist movement, which are people who are deeply devoted to sort of evaluating their own beliefs and questioning their own beliefs and setting up an ethos of, just because the tribe says it, I'm not going to reject it. I'm not going to accept it. I'm going to question it. I don't think it's a very popular movement. So, but I would hope it becomes more popular.
But it's also very difficult, right? Because if you
Yes.
spend all your time tracking down the evidence or the chain of reasoning that leads to a given belief, you've got no time to do anything else. So again, like with intuition being a shortcut, you've got to take shortcuts in the world of belief. And one of the shortcuts we take is, well, if that group or that person says it's true, no, 95% of the time I'm going to say it's true too, without checking.
There are at least two forces here. One is what you're talking about, which is, big debate about COVID over whether it's a lab leak or a natural origin. I'm really going to spend all the time working on it. Like, I got other things to do. My tribe says it's natural origin. I'll go for that.
Right.
And then the second thing is that if for some reason I did do the work and become skeptical of the view of my tribe, then they'll banish me. Then I won't get invited to the fancy parties. I won't, I won't get the awards. Nobody will love me. That's really rough. That's a high cost to pay for trying to get things right.
Right.
And so I'd like to be optimistic that we could kind of, just similar to other things we're talking about, override the sort of evolutionary wiring, the adaptive thing, in this case saying, go with the tribe, please the tribe, learn from the tribe, and have more of an allegiance to the truth.
Right.
At our best, this is what scientists try to do. This is the program of science, at our best.
Right. Now, of course, a lot of people will look at modern physics, I see this online all the time, and say, it's just groupthink. They've been working on dark matter for, since the 1930s. They don't yet know what it is, and that they won't give it up because that's what the group says it has to be. Now, in a way, I get where they're coming from. It drives me a little bit crazy because we love new ideas that actually have a basis in reality. And if a better idea comes along, we're open to thinking about it and testing it and so forth. But yeah, I think, this notion of being part of a group think can be very illuminating, but it can also be misleading. So I think you just have to wield this sword with great care.
Well, I'll ask you a question similar
Sure.
to what you asked me before. In your field, at the highest levels, what percentage would you say is motivated by an honest desire for the truth, a belief that this is where the facts have taken us, and how much of it is a desire to get awards, please your advisor, stay on scientific committees, and basically support your people?
Yeah, no, look, maybe I'm naive and idealistic, but I'd say that the percent is enormously high in favor of those that are doing what they do to find the truth. The physicists that I spend time with, sure, who wouldn't mind getting a Nobel Prize or the Breakthrough Prize? Yeah, but I never have been in a conversation where there was ever a hint of a possibility that that's why somebody was doing what they were doing. Moreover, maybe there's a half of an example, if you push me, that I could come up with where some physicists perhaps were holding to a perspective because it had held sway for decades and yet had not been awarded anything, and the idea of letting it go with, without the recognition, maybe half of a single example, maybe. And so I find it incredibly rare that people are motivated, in physics at least, by truly anything but the truth. And yet the weird thing is, I see online, even people to me, they say, Brian Greene won't let go of string theory it's a failed theory. They say it's dead. And my view is, I don't care if string theory is right or wrong. I care about the truth, and if you can come and prove to me that string theory is wrong, I would never think about it again. If there's a mathematical inconsistency that you can show, where the math doesn't work, done, gone, finished, kaput, won't think about the theory again. But the fact of the matter is, it's a rich mathematical theory that's never encountered a problem of that sort. We don't know if it's right or wrong because we can't make contact with observation or experiment yet, because the ideas are so far away from the reach of technology. That's an interesting circumstance to be in, an interesting theory on paper that you can't yet test. What do you do with that? I don't think you throw it away, I think you pursue it. But it's totally in the service of truth. It's not in the service of having something to talk about. In fact, these days, I don't even talk about string theory that much. Here we are talking about the brain and consciousness, you know.
So why do you think, you think people get it wrong? You think they're too cynical? I think what we were talking about is a pretty good description of how politics works. But you say in the sciences, or at least in the sciences that you're most familiar with, it's not true. There really is a sort of high level aspiration for the truth. So why are people so cynical? Is it just sort of sour grapes they're left behind and they...
There are certainly, if I was to name names, there are some sour grapes examples.
It's just us. Go ahead.
No, which I won't do. But I think it is probably more a feature of the fact that in the wider world, perhaps these more sinister and cynical perspectives are relevant. You know, I don't think the current president of the United States is there because he wants to really make America better. I think the president wants to make one person or one family better. I mean, again, now I'm going to get excoriated in the comments for that, bringing in politics to our conversation about science. But if you ask me, I think that there are many examples in the real world where there are people who are motivated by things that are far from pristine, and so naturally people sometimes imagine the same thing is happening in every field. And look, there may be some physicists who fit that mold, but the vast majority that I'm familiar with do not.
I mean, this may be getting into sort of a self-congratulation thing, but I agree with you. I think, you know, human beings are very smart. We have we're evolved creatures. We have all sorts of flaws and sins and self-serving biases, but we manage to create certain cultural institutions that help us aspire towards the truth. And I think the number one institution is science. And that, you know, mechanisms of peer review, open criticism, open debate, set up a situation where just because I really believe I'm right, and just because it's important for me career-wise to believe I'm right, I'm now surrounded by a bunch of people with their own motivations to tell me I'm wrong, and I got to listen to them, and I got to respond to them, or nobody will respect me. Now, immediately people say, well, we're being naive, and we should say there are countless cases of scientists who have been proven where this model does fall apart, where there's cronyism and status love above and beyond. Sort of, if we focus on status, not the quality of ideas.
Yeah.
But we're fallible creatures, and this institution of science, I think, is one of our, maybe the great success stories of our species regarding finding truth.
Yeah. No, I mean, we maybe are preaching to the mutually converted, but
we're just congratulating each other on how pristine we are.
Keep on going. Another arena that I know that you've spent time thinking about and have a somewhat unusual perspective on is the notion of empathy and the role that empathy can and should and does play in human relations. So can you take us through some of your thinking on that?
Yeah, so I wrote a book a while, 10 years ago now, called Against Empathy.
And that's an unusual phrase, right?
It was an unusual phrase. The subtitle rescues it a bit. It's called The Case for Rational Compassion. So if you just read the title, you might think I'm a psychopath of some sort. But no, rational compassion, that sounds a bit nicer.
Right.
The book focused on the question of how to be a good person. And what is it when we are good people. And one way to frame this is, if we reflect and we say, how should we live our lives? What's the best way to do things? And reflect as groups of people, by ourselves, and take that as a model, the sort of reflective discussion, not heated, not angry, not emotional, of what the best thing is to do. And then ask, how could we get there? And what a lot of people say in response is, follow your heart. Follow your heart. if you feel love, act upon that. If you feel empathy, act upon that. Compassion, and so on. And what I argued is that our gut feelings our heart has evolved through natural selection and has evolved to help us, our kin, ourselves, our tribe, friends. But it doesn't scale. It has all sorts of various problems and doesn't scale. And one example goes back to what we talked about before, which is we feel very strong empathy in a sense of putting ourselves in another person's shoes, feeling their pain, for people who are our friends, who look like us, who speak our language. And so if I was going to let empathy guide me, I direct all the resources in the world to people who look like me, to my family, my friends, and everything. People of dark skin, people who don't speak English, people who I never see, screw them. And that's the morality you get from empathy. Tremendous kindness, no doubt about that, but towards those who are close to you.
And that makes sense evolutionary, right? We were in small groups.
It makes total sense evolutionary. It's again, and again, we're not talking, we're going over the same theme over and over again in different domains, which I really like, which is, here's what we've evolved, here's what we want to be. In case of, we've evolved an understanding of the physics of trees and rocks, but we want to have an understanding of the universe. We've evolved an understanding of 1, 2, 3, but we want to know about negative numbers and square roots and infinities. We've evolved a Stone Age morality. Help me, help my kids, help my friends. Better than nothing. Better than nothing. And it has real value. But what I argue in the book is we could do better. And that we often are capable of doing better. Here's a simple case. If I'm hiring a research assistant in my department, I can't hire one of my sons. And if I have a class that I'm teaching, I can't grade my family members and my best friends. Seems obvious. But why? Because we recognize, I'd want to, but we recognize because we've got biases. So we want to set up a system that your biases don't mess things up. I think in general, most people could recognize that it's wrong for us to direct resources, say, for me, if I was in charge of directing resources, to people with light skin and not towards people with dark skin. They say, this is wrong, that's racist, that's a terrible way to be. Recognizing that is, I think, part of a sort of expanded, rich understanding of morality. And I think our emotions push us in the opposite way. Our emotions are biased, they're parochial, they're narrow. And while you need the sort of kick in the pants of the emotions to do good in the first place, you need compassion, you should use rationality to figure out how to exercise it.
And how good are we at doing that?
Your mileage may vary. I think we're very good at thinking we're doing that. I think we're very good at thinking, oh, I'm applying my principles fairly and so on. But often we do favor those who are close to us. But we're not incapable of doing this. And in some way, we talked about science before as an institution for getting at the truth. I think law and politics are institutions for, at their best, just focus on law, at our best at sort of being our best moral beings. So, the law is indifferent to skin color. Even if the judge is white, the judge is not supposed to give lesser sentences to people who are accused of crimes who are white. That's obvious. In fact, it would be a crime for the judge to do it. And I think that you get there not through gut feelings. Gut feelings say, yeah, help those who look like you, but through sort of a higher level rationality, an appreciation that, I forget what philosopher said this, maybe Sidgwick, from the point of view of the universe, things look differently. From my point of view, there's nothing more important than my son, my wife. From your point of view, there's nothing more important than those you love. But we're both smart enough to recognize that this reflects our own bias. And from the point of view of the universe or God or whatever have you, those you love are just as valuable as those I love. And we might want to coordinate things and say, okay, let's have laws and charitable systems and governments that treat all these people the same. And even extend them to people who don't look at all like us and don't speak our language and live in another country, and say they deserve all of that too. And where I differ from some psychologists is I don't think this comes naturally. I think naturally we're good. Go back to the question you asked before. We're a good species. We're also little bigots. We're bigoted and prejudiced and tribal. But I do think somehow, just as science has kind of accelerated us to a certain point, the liberation can get to a point where we become better than we started off. And that's my complaint against motions.
And so back to the question I asked you before about I-95 and your foot on the gas. If more people were aware of the natural cognitive biases of which you're making reference to, would it make it easier or more effective for us as a society to do the right thing because we know that our gut may lead us in the direction of the wrong thing?
It's in all my interest to say yes, because then people will pay me money to give talks, and I write books, and I'll make you better by telling you the insights of evolutionary psychology. My answer is maybe. I don't think it could hurt to know how our appetites work, to know what we evolved to be, and to appreciate there's a distinction between the way we naturally feel at a gut level versus the way we should aspire to be. But in the end, I don't think understanding is enough. I think we get there through the creation of institutions and sort of various practices. I think knowing how probability works does not keep people away from losing their money at casinos. And similarly, I don't think knowing about evolutionary psychology.
But it's interesting that you say that, because it certainly prevents me from losing money at casinos. In fact, I've been in casinos with people who don't understand the probabilities, and one example in particular where an individual won at like one of these machines.
Uh-oh, that's dangerous.
And I was like, now we leave. And this individual did not want to leave because, well, if we hit the jackpot,
Yeah.
So I do think that kind of knowledge can help, but I guess these other situations are more subtle, nuanced, messy.
They're more, and they speak to sort of motivations. I'll give you another example. It might be knowing calorie counts and nutritional facts will make me eat better. But I don't know. It's hamburgers and tacos and nachos taste so good, and
as long as there's no cheese.
As long as there's no cheese, there you got me. And I think that we often do better. We do better if I live in a place that has no Burger King like next to me. If I'm an alcoholic, knowing about the ravage of alcoholism is useful,
right.
But better to not have any booze in my house.
Right.
And the way societies work, good societies, in some ways we all live in good societies because they're much better than the alternative, isn't by sort of explaining to people, look, this is the way things, don't you understand? We all do better when we help our neighbors. We're in a prisoner's dilemma, and we're in a tragedy of the commons, and we should all subserve our own interests, diminish our own interests to help others. We also have laws, and you say, but if you're tempted to do it, you'll end up in prison. And we have customs. Which is, we not only tell people that if you treat people rudely, it's not a good way to live your life because you wouldn't want them to treat you rudely. That's part of it. But you also said if you treat people rudely, nobody hangs out with you. And I think one of the reasons why people are, and I really do believe it's less racist than we used to be, is in part because some of the beliefs that were associated with racism were proven to be false. But also in part because people think racism is disgusting. And if you do racist things and you act in racist ways, nobody likes you. And so even politicians who have racist policies have to cloak it, have to hide it. And that's a form of progress.
Right, for sure. Now, underlying all of this is the belief that, we freely choose to treat people one way or another, or to act on X or do Y. And then another enormous question that people have struggled with forever is the question of, do we have that kind of freedom of the will? And as a physicist who's deeply a physicalist, a materialist, using the language that you made reference to earlier on,
yep.
You know, I don't just go down to the cellular level. I mean, I go down to the protons, neutrons, electrons, and quarks, and I know they aren't free. I understand well the mathematical equations by which their behavior is determined, at least quantum mechanically so. And then I see you as a big collection of all these quantum mechanically determined ingredients, and I don't see any opportunity for somebody called Paul Bloom to intercede in how Paul Bloom's particles behave. And so fundamentally, I don't see any opening for free will. Is that at odds with your view of the world or irrelevant to your view of the world?
No, I 100% agree with it. I mean, if I was to say, look, I'm going to go down to the soda machine later on and buy a Diet Coke, but I could always get a root beer instead, and I'm choosing to do it and everything. And you would say, no. When you leave that thing, you're going to be holding a Coke or a root beer in your hands. And if I knew a full description of all your elementary particles, I could tell which one.
Or at least by which probability would be higher, say.
By which probability would be higher. And you might say, some people say, oh, there's some randomness in it. But whatever, that random, that doesn't change.
Doesn't help.
I say, because I don't want to be random, I want to choose. So in that way, the whole world is determined. And in some way, I mean, there's many different ways to make the argument. One way is that you might feel you choose to do things, but why do you make some choices rather than others? Well, because of ways you are. Well, why are you that way? Well, ultimately, it just goes back to factors out of your control. I guess, and here's where we may disagree, is that I am a sort of compatibilist, where I think everything you said is true. It's a deterministic universe all the way down. But at the same time, the way I get to the Coke machine and the way I end up with something in my hand, you could imagine doing it in a random mechanical way, but the way I do it is by weighting choices, thinking, oh, do I want this drink, do I want that drink, maybe I don't want to drink at all, maybe weighing options, putting weights on them and everything. Having the experience of making decisions, of choosing, of deliberating, reasoning. And if you looked at my brain, that's what you'd find it. The reasoning things are all lit up, the options are doing it. So in some sense, I do choose. Maybe in some sense we could call that freedom. But if it is freedom, it has to be in the constraints of that it is really true, as you pointed out, I couldn't have done otherwise.
Yeah.
And so I'm a compatibilist in that way.
So I don't know that I would go as far as calling myself a compatibilist, but I do say that the intuitive notion of free will does work so long as you insert one additional word. Instead of saying that I made the decision, I put in, I feel that I made the decision.
Yes.
And that feeling is absolutely real. It's an undeniable feeling that I, say, went for the root beer instead of the Coke. The feeling was real, but the freedom is not.
Yeah.
But from a standpoint of everyday life, it's enough for many things to simply acknowledge that the feeling of freedom is a real feeling, even if the freedom itself doesn't exist.
I think something like that's going to be right. And I also think it makes a real difference. Suppose we were sitting across from each other, and all of a sudden you threw your drink in my face. And then there's two possibilities. You say, oh my God, my arm twitched. I'm sorry, I have this problem, my arm, it just twitched. I didn't choose to do it. Versus you say, there's a limit to how much nonsense I'm going to take from you. That was the limit. I did that on purpose. In the first case, it was unchosen. In the second case, it was chosen. If it's chosen, then I could hold you morally responsible. I could yell at you. I could take a swing at you. I could take you to court. You know, and there's a logic to this, because if it's chosen, that means it's subject to incentives. So you chose to do it. Now you paid a consequence, so you won't do it next time. If it's a twitch of your arm, those things don't work. You can't control it. And sometimes when we say things are chosen, what we mean is it's in the space of things that are influenced by argument, by incentives, by deliberation, very real things in a deterministic universe.
Right.
And so I don't mind determinism. I think there's a lot to it. But regardless, you have to make a distinction between reflexes and things that are a result of deliberation and consideration and reason.
Yeah, and I completely agree with that, because for me, the only rational basis for punitive response to an individual's behavior is if that punitive response can shape further future behaviors, either of that individual or of the society at large. And even things that are determined, even in the quantum mechanical sense, they can learn from experience. The example I love to give is, if you have one of those fancy Roombas, it maps your living room. I don't think it has free will, but when it smashes into the leg of the sofa repeatedly, it maps that and it can go around it. So a non-free-willed collection of particles can learn from past experience. And so if we can learn from experience, and if that experience is punitive in order to extinguish certain future behaviors, I think that's a valid and justifiable route to holding people responsible, even if they don't have freedom of the will.
I think you're probably right, but this is yet another case where it's an unnatural and unintuitive view you have. So you're saying that, one should punish the person who murdered a child because that way they'll be less likely to murder a child in the future and will discourage others from murdering a child. It makes the world better in that way. But our common sense doesn't think that. They think, what a horrible thing, that person should pay.
Yeah.
And then somebody comes in, no, if you punish that person, it won't make a difference, say. Still, I don't care. They did something terrible, they should pay. I think your view is more evolved, maybe in a literal sense.
Right.
But it's not very intuitive.
Right, I agree it's not intuitive, but it helps me in two ways. One, and again, the I-95 example is well applicable to me too, because I've got the usual human emotions and reactions too, but looking at things this way tends to make me less retributive in my stance in the world. And it also allows me, and maybe you call this a fallacy, but it allows me to not get as caught up as I otherwise would be in regret. So when I look at things that perhaps I could have imagined doing something else than I actually did, and in retrospect I wish I did, I now, and for a long time, stand back and say, isn't it too bad that my particles went left instead of right? It's interesting that they did, but that was what the laws of physics demanded that they do, and they had no choice in the matter. So I'm able to step back and not feel it quite as deeply as I otherwise would.
But let me ask you, you're a man of no few accomplishments. You've done well. Does this also obliterate pride?
It does. Absolutely. So if I do something that's good, say in the view of the world, if I just be grandiose for a moment, I do look at it as, wow, I'm glad that my particles did that, wrote that sentence or found that equation or published. But again, just as in the negative case of regret, in the positive case too, it certainly tamps it all down completely.
That is a very unnatural way of thinking. Again, you may be right, but it goes to show how it goes to show the sort of duality we've been playing with, which is, there's no, you didn't think this way when you were 4 years old,
right?
And most humans would never think of it this way, and you got there through culture and science and deliberation and reflection. This anthropologist has this line that we're not fallen angels, we're risen apes.
Yeah.
And this is the examples of, I think, the rising.
Yeah. So just one final topic, if you still have the patience to sit with me for a touch more. We began sort of with the hard problem of consciousness, which is a tricky one. I'd like to end with a difficult one too, but perhaps more personal, which is how people try to find meaning and purpose, and whether some of the insights of the work that you do can help us along in that regard. And I know that you've spent some time thinking about the role of suffering in this endeavor, and maybe just paint the landscape a little bit of your thinking, and then we can probe it a little bit more.
I think you're asking a good question, and it's one that people in my field wouldn't have asked for quite a while. We've been obsessed, psychology has been obsessed a long time with pleasure and happiness. What makes people happy, what gives them pleasure. I think those are great questions too. I wrote a book called How Pleasure Works, all about how we get pleasure from things. But I don't think that's all we want. I think we want to go through life. We definitely want to be happy, but we also want to make a difference. We want to carry our obligations and be good people. Maybe some of us want a spiritual existence, and I think we all want meaning. And it's a very, of all these terms we're using, meaning is the hardest to define, but it is something that we aspire to. And I wrote this book called The Sweet Spot, which was about the role of suffering in attaining meaning. And I came to sort of two conclusions. One is that unchosen suffering, the bad things that happen to us, being assaulted, having somebody we love die, house burns down, getting cancer, really bad for us. And actually, despite when people say about post-traumatic growth and wisdom through pain and everything that, most of the evidence supports a sort of common sense view this time, which is that bad things are bad things. Try to avoid them, we're more resilient than most people believe. Not every bad thing causes PTSD. We tend to bounce back, many of us, after, at least soon later or years later. But still, bad things are bad things. But then there's chosen suffering. And I think a good life is filled with chosen suffering, taking suffering in a broad way, meaning effort, difficulty, struggle. And it's a really cool fact about people that we do that. In the smallest of ways, I wake up in the morning and I open up, take my phone, and I do the New York Times connections and spelling bee. The little word games that tax my mind. Why are you taxing your mind? Like, no one's giving you money for this. You're nowhere near good enough at these things for anybody to think better of you. Why are you doing this? And I think because we like a little bit of struggle. And then we like big struggles. We like to, people train for marathons. They learn new languages. They travel through the world. They go camping and hiking. They do MMA, mixed martial arts. They do Brazilian jiu-jitsu. They learn to dance. They do all of these things which are hard. And the hardness is not, it's a feature, not a bug. In that if you want to find meaning in your life, you got to do hard things. There's different theories for why most people don't regret having kids, why most people think having kids is important and valuable and meaningful. And one theory, which I think has a lot of force to it, is because it's so damn hard. It's so damn hard that the rewards just bounce out and have real meaning and so on.
But is it as simple as saying that in order to have the highest highs, you want the gap to the lowest lows to be as big as possible? Is it sort of just resetting our base so that...
Some of it is that. Some of it is simple contrast. There's these laboratory studies that find that when you're exposed to a little bit of pain, a neutral stimulus that normally we'd feel nothing becomes positive in the contrast. It's the logic of the hot bath, the sauna, the spicy food. You fill your mouth up with chicken vindaloo and it's burning, and you drink some cool beer and you're back to normal, but normal doesn't feel normal. Normal feels terrific. The hot bath burns and it's awful, then the temperature lowers and it doesn't feel neutral, it feels blissful. I think that's part of it. But that's not really what I'm talking about. What I'm talking about is sort of sustained difficulty and effort for a long period in a project that has to have some value. I mean, it's difficult for you to walk around your office 10,000 times. But this is not meaningful. That's just dumb. But it's also difficult. But training for marathon, climbing Mount Kilimanjaro, raising a child, starting a charity, are difficult things, but they have some value to them. And I think that's what makes for a good life. Alongside pleasure and happiness and, fun with friends and sex and dancing and so on, that's good too. But meaning and struggle is this, it's in some way a case where modern psychology has met up with ancient wisdom, because I'm not telling you anything that, a rabbi or priest wouldn't tell you either.
One of my heroes, or, in the psychology, sociology arena is someone named Ernest Becker. Do you know the name Ernest Becker?
Denial of Death.
Denial of Death. So I read that book, when I was quite young, and had a tremendous impact on me. And when I hear you speak about suffering, it brings the following thought to mind. I'm wondering if it's at all resonant. So if you take Becker's perspective that, we are basically the only species on Earth that's aware of its own mortality. You can make some arguments that maybe elephants, have some rituals around it, but we're really the only one that can truly imagine the past and imagine a future where we won't be here or our loved ones won't be here. I think we're the only species that does that, and that drives, at least according to Becker's viewpoint, a lot of our behaviors. Could it be that the suffering that you make reference to is our microcosm of overcoming death?
That's interesting. In part, maybe. I don't think it's quite. I don't think it's entirely that way, because suffering and struggle give value even for non-humans. Rats that struggle to get a food like the food more than if they got it for free.
I mean, you can measure that and
Yep, standard methods. I think with dogs and other creatures, probably I heard a study with ants, but I haven't looked at it closely, that there's an association with struggle and difficulty and pain with value. When what you're talking about is a little bit more highfalutin, but I don't doubt that something like that works. I never really thought about the connection with knowledge and fear of death. I know there are a lot of philosophers who said that if we didn't die, if we were immortal, everything would lose value. That the pressure of time on us, the pressure of, no, you can't put it off forever, that there's a clock on it. Makes life worse in an obvious way, but also makes life better, in that it gives value to our relationships, to our pursuits, and to our struggles. And I think there's some truth to that.
Yeah, and for those in our audience, there's this wonderful book, I forget the name, I'm so bad with names, Samuel Scheffler, I think, may be a philosopher.
Yes, that's right.
Written on
That's
this,
right.
so it was very, very insightful. But as we're on this...
I was just going to say, there were two books I read as I wrote my own book that I bet you've read them too. One is by Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi, called Flow.
Yes.
And it was, I read this when I was a kid. The first time I read it was like a teenager or something. And to me it was like, wow, the best things in life, he argued, are not lying on the beach sipping a pina colada. In fact, he says people kind of find that boring and a little bit stressful. It's when you lose yourself in something. You lose yourself in something difficult. And then there's Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning, which is the story of how he was in the Holocaust and he was in different concentration camps, and his analysis of what distinguished those who survived versus those who didn't. And he said that it was purpose, it was meaning. A man of a reason to act can survive anything.
Right.
A reason to live. And I think those are really powerful books.
And most of our reasons for living are manufactured. I mean, much as we discussed before, many of our memories are. How do my view on that is that makes them all the more wondrous, that we collections of particles can dream up things that grab us so fully that we go into that flow state, that we are captivated and fully immersed within these activities that take us to a transcendent place. That to me is wondrous, but some say, without some external divine presence or something that's objectively of value in the world, none of this stuff matters.
I like that way of looking at it. We do live in manufactured worlds, and our pursuits are manufactured in that, it could have been, it was not so long ago that we'd run around trying to capture, kill animals and eat them and have sex and build shelter and everything. And now here we are over Zoom talking about great ideas, and so much of my own life and my own pleasures are the pleasures of fiction. Yeah. I think I spent, more time thinking about the characters in Sopranos than many members of my family. That I spend a lot more time reading than I do hunting and killing animals. I listen to podcasts. And we don't live in the world anymore. We live in each other's heads.
Yeah.
And that's terrific.
Yeah.
I love it.
So one final thing, you made reference before to Daniel Kahneman. You said the one individual who won the Nobel Prize in the field, and you also made reference to his recent passing. As some in the audience no doubt know, his passing was by assisted suicide, right?
Yeah.
So he had decided, for a variety of reasons, that he had lived the life that he wanted to live, and it was time to disconnect. What do you think about that?
It's funny you should ask that. I've had discussions with many people about this. I was not. I met Danny Kahneman a few times, but we're not close friends. But I have friends who are close friends of his, and they were aghast when he said he was going to kill himself. And finally, he said the decision's been made. What made it somewhat puzzling was, by his own description, he was in fine physical and mental health. It was fine enough for a man of that age. And so there was no pressing need. It wasn't like he was in pain. It wasn't like he was imminently going to be in great pain and suffering. It wasn't like he was going to lose his cognitive facilities. He kind of wanted to end on a high note, I think. And in fact, it's funny because his own research says when you think about an experience, you judge it not by summing up all the positives and negatives, but by its peak, its highest point, and its end, peak-end theory. And it's as if Kahneman took this in his own life and said, I want to end on a high note and don't want to go down, 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 and end there, even if this is better than, some baseline. Me, I think he made a mistake. He's the most brilliant psychologist ever, and one of the most brilliant people I've ever encountered. And I think he made a mistake. I think he lived his life, made his decision as if there's going to be another end where you're going to look back on that experience, his life, and say, that was a great life because I ended on a high note. But that's not how it works. The way it is with a life is, my own belief is, when it's over, it's over. And then you should try to sort of, as long as it's working for you, as long as you're getting joy and pleasure, why stop?
Yeah.
As long as people who love you and you love them back, why stop? And again, I also feel it's his choice, and I feel a little bit bad, second guessing his choice. But it is his choice. But you asked, and I don't think that was the right decision to make.
Yeah.
What do you think?
Well, it's interesting if you've lived through the final months or years of life for individuals who've gone beyond a point of making a decision, and their life has degraded in its experience so radically that it's hard to see the value that's providing them any longer beyond suffering. And so the tricky thing is, how do you know where the line is between having the presence to make that kind of decision versus crossing the line when you no longer have the capacity to do so? And so I have a lot of sympathy for that point of view. I think I agree with you that when it comes to me, one more day with my kids or my wife would be worth staying. But I certainly understand the reasoning behind, and I believe that Kahneman's wife had already passed. I think it was a difficult end for her, if I'm remembering things that I've read. So I have great sympathy for what he did, but I think I agree that when it comes to my own life, I don't think I would do that.
That's a perfectly fair point. I don't have a religious view that says life is sacred and shouldn't be ended under any circumstances.
Yeah.
And I know people, including somebody I was very, very close to. He wouldn't have ended it anyway. He was a religious man, but his death came way too late.
Yeah.
A period of great pain and great indignity. And one way of looking at what Kahneman did, which I could respect, was it's a form of risk aversion, which is, sometimes what happens when you're in your 90s, things could drop all of a sudden.
Yeah.
And then you may be at a point where the choice is taken away from you.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so maybe he decided to cash in his chips before running the risk of a catastrophic loss. And I could respect that.
And it's someone who certainly took his own intellectual views to the limit. So you got to respect that fully. So.
And, I feel his friends, in the nicest way, were greedy, in that he was very, very brilliant man, but also charming and funny and warm and simply a mensch. And they wanted a world with him rather than a world without him, and saying to him, look, I know you want to go, we don't want you to go.
Right. Totally understand on both sides. Well, Paul, this has really been a wonderful conversation. Thank you so much for spending the time with us and sharing all of the insights on this wide range of subjects on the human mind and the human brain. So thanks so much for joining us.
This has been a delight, Brian. I hope we get a chance to do it one day again.
Absolutely. Thank you. All right. Talk soon. Bye.